Well, hello, everybody. I'm extremely pleased to welcome Rachel Wahl to today's meeting. Rachel teaches and researches at the University of Virginia, as you read in the notes that were distributed, and her special interests have been in conflict and dialogue, as you've seen also from her publications, very interesting range of publications. What she's also done quite recently is to edit and introduce the suite of papers that we published in the Journal of Philosophy of Education last year, which is on René Arcila's book about Wim Wenders' films. And I'd recommend that suite to you, as well as, of course, Rachel's other writings. So, Rachel, can I hand over to you to talk to us tonight about agency?
Thank you so much. And thank you to Professor Sandish for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here and have the chance to share my work and talk about it with all of you. I'm going to share my screen here.
Rachel, we tend to use just first names, so you're welcome just to do that. Okay.
Oh, good to know. Thank you. Let's see. Now, Paul and I did try this ahead of time and it worked very well, but now it's not allowing me to flip through slides. So I'm going to just stop the share and try again.
Hello, Jeff. Hello, Jeremy. We're just sorting out the slides for a moment.
Round two.
We're not seeing anything just yet, Rachel. Okay.
Yes, it's a little strange since it worked so well just a moment ago, but I just decided to restart to see if we would gain some more success. Yeah, okay, let's see.
Good.
It wouldn't be a Zoom presentation without some technical difficulty, right? All right, can everybody see my slide now?
That looks great, yes.
Okay, great, fantastic. Okay. So what I'll be speaking about today is a part of my work that in general draws on studies that I've been conducting over the last several years on dialogue in different contexts. And can all of you still hear me? Is the sound okay? Paul, I'll look to you. Can you hear me?
I think it's good. Yes, okay. I think so.
Okay, so over the last couple of years, starting in 2015, I've been conducting studies of political dialogue in different contexts. So dialogue between police and communities, dialogue in communities recovering from violence, as well as dialogue between politically opposed university students. And I'll be talking about a piece of this today, which is a particular argument around the role of a form of agency, a particular form of a sense of one's own capacity to affect one's life in the world that I'll argue is cultivated particularly within the modern liberal tradition and is essential to democratic citizenship and democratic participation, but also in some settings can undermine aspects of the democratic life world, especially in settings that are highly polarized and volatile. And I will be talking about what I mean by this as we go on in the presentation. So first, I'm going to give you a little bit of context for why I'm doing this work and the general set of arguments around it. You have probably not been able to escape in some form arguments in the popular press over the idea of civility. So depending on who you ask, civic conversations or civil political dialogue is either the key to saving our democracy or it is a tool of oppression. So for some people, it is the decrease in the capacity of people who disagree with each other to speak with each other civilly that is unraveling our democracies, both in the United States as well as to some extent, I think, in the UK, although it's been a particularly salient argument in the Trump and post-Trump years in the US, though it's certainly not limited to this setting. And then to many other people, it is precisely this demand for civil conversation, for civic dialogue, that is deepening oppression, deepening inequity, because it is precisely the demand that people have these kinds of polite conversations that sidelines righteous anger, that makes righteous protest seem illegitimate, and therefore deepens the injustices that give rise to that protest. And you see the same divide in political theory. So just to gloss this very quickly, deliberative theorists argue that deliberation is at the heart of democracy. So while other forms of democratic participation aggregate interests or oppose them to each other, deliberation improves and deepens decisions, as well as legitimates decisions, as well as cultivates trust among citizens. Whereas theorists of what is often called agonism argue, like the more popular critics of deliberation, that it is these kinds of conversation that is deepening injustice, that democracies are full of competing interests, that deliberation tends to further legitimize the interests of dominant groups and mistake those interests for the common sense, and that if you prioritize these conversations rather than contests like political campaigns and social movements, you're going to end up further legitimizing the dominant status quo. So you have this divide both in political theory and in the popular press.
Rachel, let me interrupt just a minute. We're getting a little bit of distortion, at least I'm getting it. So perhaps if you'd make a point fairly slowly, that will help. Just some of the words are getting a little bit distorted. Okay.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Thank you.
How is this right now?
That sounds very good to me.
Okay. Maybe if I lean forward like this, I might have been a little.
Okay. Ilya has just said it's okay. Perhaps it's just mine, slight distortion here, but carry on anyway, please.
Okay.
I'll interrupt again if necessary.
Not a problem. So this is the general setting in which I've been writing a book manuscript on political dialogue. And the overarching question of this book is on the role of political dialogue in democracy. And within that, there are several more specific questions. For one, what is it about the contemporary period that makes exchanges across these divides so controversial? So it's not only that we're fighting about the issues themselves, but we're also fighting about whether and how we should be talking to each other. Two, what happens when people try to have these conversations? And more particularly, what is the meaning of these conversations for changes in individuals as well as for changes in institutions? How does dialogue interact with other methods of attempts to influence change in a democracy, such as protest? And in what ways might these dialogues cause harm, and to whom? And how might they strengthen movements for social justice, and how? So these are the different topics that I look at in the book. The book that this argument is based in is divided into two parts. The first part is looking at politically opposed university students. The second is looking at police and communities of color. And I'm dividing it in this way because I think it's important to think about the difference between dialogue between individuals, which is what I'll be talking about today, and dialogue that's really intended to change an institution, which is a whole different kettle of fish, I think is the technical term. And so the university student data that I will be drawing on is based on observations I conducted of dialogues between politically opposed university students on college campuses. And I observed these dialogues between 2017 and 2019. I conducted 57 in-depth semi-structured interviews with 51 students in the weeks following their dialogue participation. And I then conducted follow-up interviews with students who I could reach and who agreed to talk to me again in 2020. And just a note about what was happening at these dialogues I observed, they are what I'm calling deliberative dialogue because they integrate two distinct elements. One is political argumentation about an issue, and two is this hermeneutical or humanizing element in which the questions are really directed toward understanding another person rather than only their views. So the dialogues that I observed had both of these characteristics, and I'm happy to say more about what happened at these different dialogues if anyone is interested. And I'll be focusing today on a specific subset of this data, the deliberative dialogues that took place at universities just in the spring and fall of 2017. And in particular, dialogues that took place between students who were conservative Christians, most of whom attended a particular Christian university, as well as secular liberal students, most of whom attended the University of Pennsylvania. And with these students, I had conducted 43 interviews with 37 students. And the paper that I'll be discussing today is based on one chapter of the book. And I also wrote a paper based on this idea for the Journal of Philosophy of Education for a special issue on virtues and vices, which is forthcoming from Job. To analyze this data, I transcribed every interview in full and coded the full transcripts using the software Deduce. I conducted several rounds of inductive and deductive coding. I'm happy to talk in detail about this. The deductive codes were based on dialogic and deliberative theory, whereas the inductive codes were based on my emerging understanding of the meaning of these dialogues for students. The forms of learning that I saw emerging from the transcripts. My methodology, however, is really based in the philosophical work of Charles Taylor. So Taylor talks about the philosophical anthropology, and he means something different than that term is typically used. So whereas we often think of philosophical anthropology to mean philosophical questions about the nature of the person, Taylor actually really means it in an ethnographic sense. So Taylor says, we don't really get a hold on what an ethic is really about until we see it very often enacted. So a lot of my work is really trying to see what ethics look like when they're enacted, how people live their ideas, what it means to live an idea. And I also draw heavily on Taylor's conception of the primacy of moral orientation to identity. So he says to know who you are is to be oriented in moral space. And so a lot of the interviews I do are really trying to understand how people understand themselves in terms of their ideas about good and bad. And all of this for Taylor, as well as for me, is based on an idea of what he calls the social imaginary, which, in his words, is something much broader and deeper than the intellectual schemes people may entertain when they think about social reality in a disengaged mode. I am thinking rather of the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. So in other words, the social imaginary is not so much the consciously held opinions people have, but the backdrop, the tacit understandings that make sense of those opinions, that make sense of what's possible to think, to believe, to want. So whereas Taylor applies this understanding to an intellectual history, I look at how contemporary people live their ideas and the implications for formation through dialogue. And again, this is based in a particular chapter where I'm looking in particular at how deeply different social and moral imaginaries inform the way people respond to dialogue. Are you all still with me? Zoom presentations can be quite challenging, not only for the listeners, but because it's hard to tell whether I am successfully communicating. Can everybody hear me still? Life is going on. All right, good. I'm going to keep going. It's going to get even more exciting, don't worry. Okay, so what did I find? I found that for students of all political persuasions, conservative students, what in the United States would be referred to as liberals, but what is really a term that encompasses students whose politics are on the left in the sense of being sympathetic with egalitarian politics, as well as students who are what could be termed progressives in the sense of being liberal in regard to social but not economic issues. and students who in the United States are thought of as social conservatives, particularly because they are conservative about either social issues or economic issues, which are grouped together in our politics, as you likely know, often uncomfortably and strangely. So students of all of these political persuasions walked away thinking, when asked, that the most meaningful part of these experiences was that at the end of the night, they were friends with people they disagreed with. And remember that these conversations took place in the months following the election of Donald Trump. One of these conversations took place only a few weeks after Trump's inauguration, when there was a sense of intense anxiety and panic on the part of students on the left. And the idea of being friends with people who had voted for Trump was unsettling. And it was unsettling to students on both sides of the political aisle, but for very different reasons. Secular liberal students tended to worry that their friendship or their possibility of friendship was bad because it made them ineffective political agents. They worried that if they were civil and receptive, then they're not going to effectively influence political outcomes. They're not going to do any good. They're not going to change anybody's mind, which means they're not going to change anybody's vote, which means that they're failing in their primary responsibility, which is to be an effective political agent. So they walked away feeling disturbed, distressed. Christian conservative students had the opposite worry. They worried that civility might make them ineffective ethical agents. They worried that if they were too civil, then they might not see the real person or reveal the truth about themselves, and therefore not be formed as deeply in a way that would challenge them ethically. So I'm going to give you some examples of what this looked like. Laura, a secular liberal student from the University of Pennsylvania, said after her dialogue experience, "We can stop seeing the other person as racist and understand that they have different priorities, but I'm still grappling with where it goes from there, which isn't to say that I don't believe the dialogue is important. I think it's really important. Understanding a person through where they came from and how they have constructed a personal history for themselves. And definitely being at a liberal college, you're taught a lot about the importance of getting different perspectives. I value that a lot, and I think it enriches my understanding of the world, but I don't know what it means in terms of practical political consequences. So in other words, understanding other people, listening to them, being receptive, being friendly is ethically good. It's good to treat other people well, but I fear that I have failed as a political agent because I'm not changing them." Whereas Kathy, a Christian conservative student from this evangelical college called Cairn, says, "Afterwards, I was a little frustrated with myself because I was more eager to not cause a vitriolic conversation than I was to get a little bit gritty. If I'm talking to someone who thinks that abortion should be legal in more measures than I think it should be legal, then I really am passionately against their view of that. But I have to get past their view of that into the person. And that way my character is changing because I have to do more work to see what's behind something, to see someone whom I can love." So she's worried that civility means that she's not fulfilling her task as an ethical agent to show up as a certain ethical creature embodying certain virtues. So they really have opposite concerns. And I suggest that this has rooted in different conceptions of moral order. So the moral order for Taylor is part of the social imaginary, and it defines our ideas about what is right in the context in which it makes sense to strive for and hope to realize the right. For the modern liberal tradition, the idea of agency is central. It's central to the modern moral order, as well as to the modern conception of personhood. So for example, Taylor says, "Free agency is central to their self-understanding. The emphasis on rights and the primacy of freedom among them as modern people in the modern liberal tradition, doesn't just stem from the principle that society should exist for the sake of its members. It also reflects the holder's sense of their own agency and of the situation that agency normatively demands in the world, namely freedom." And this sense of agency within the modern moral order comes with a sense of responsibility. We don't have the capacity to do just anything because we are totally free to have a great time. Our freedom is rooted, in fact, in a moral order in which we must do the work to realize it. So the modern moral order is not self-realizing. So as against a transcendent order, which is unchangeably so, or a hierarchical order that is ruled over by an authoritarian regime that we have no power to affect, the modern order is intrinsically the task of people to bring into fruition. And this was initially based in a religious conception of why God granted people this agency, but eventually secularized into a conception that we have this agency that we had better use to make the world a better place. And finally, the third component of this modern liberal conception of agency is that it is necessarily political, that the political is the engine for fulfilling our responsibility to use our agency well. Political society is seen as an instrument for something pre-political. Now, I argue that this way of understanding agency within the modern liberal tradition leads to two forms of instrumental thinking. One is that social structures themselves, as we know in the liberal tradition, are only valuable if they further human ends. So you can't justify society based on divine decree. You justify it by forms such as the social contract because it's beneficial to people. But also this can extend and does extend, I'm arguing, in times of particular political volatility to interaction between individuals. That interaction, action, becomes valuable to the extent that it's instrumental to political ends. So this understanding of, I'm going to go back to the slide for a moment, this understanding of political agency, of this form of one's ability to act, I'm arguing describes quite well and quite fully the way in which secular liberal students in these dialogues talk about what they're doing there and what worries them. So students like Laura, who I quoted a moment ago, essentially say, I'm worried that I didn't fulfill my responsibility. My responsibility is to be an effective political agent. That means affecting a political outcome. And I failed to do that because I was nice and reflective and friendly. And that's good, but I failed. And so this conception, this modern liberal conception of agency describes well the way these students in the dialogue talk about what worries them. And this is very, very different from what the conservative Christian students said. For these students, it is God rather than individuals who are the primary source of change. And the agency for them looks very different. They possess agency in the sense that it is their choice to show up in the way that God, they believe, is asking them to show up. But their agency is in response to an organizing power in the universe that is the actual engine of change. So conservative Christian students understand their role as to show up in a particular form of ethical relationship. And they believe that if they do that, if they show up and they're good people, which to them means being humble, receptive, patient, and unconditionally loving, then they believe that God will actually engineer the outcomes that are important to see in the world through them showing up ethically. So while secular liberal students believe that they must act instrumentally to engineer those outcomes themselves, the conservative Christian students believe that they must show up ethically and that God will do the rest. So they are released from what I'm calling the constraint of instrumentality, the constraint that a form of agency puts on people and how they respond. And they learn very differently in response to this different way of showing up. Now, this is just a little analysis I did only with the first dialogue, just to see what was happening, where I categorized different forms of learning that I saw occurring within the dialogue. It differentiated between additive learning, which is when people added information to their store of information, but didn't shift anything in their understanding as a result. It was just another data point that added to their current beliefs, versus formative learning, in which something shifted in their understanding. And I also differentiated between learning about themselves as well from learning about others. And then finally, I differentiated between, for shorthand, deliberative learning, which is about others' views of an issue, so issue-based learning, from dialogic learning, which is really about a kind of hermeneutical understanding of another person, right? And what, I just saw that this is, okay, there we go. That should be better in focus. And so what was so interesting to me is you have almost opposite numbers, even in the small number of students, the 20 students I interviewed for just this first dialogue, where you had the secular liberal students primarily adding to their store of knowledge as they learned about other students' views, whereas you had the conservative Christian students really shifting in their understanding as they learned about other people. So different forms of engagement seeming to facilitate different forms of learning. Another thing that I think this does beyond this particular definition of learning, in a broader sense in regard to the dialogue, is this understanding of agency seems to help these conservative Christian students navigate a central tension within Christianity and the liberal order, navigating what Taylor in his work has called the Nova effect. So very brief glossing, whereas in the pre-modern world, it was certainly possible to have a dark night of the soul in which one doubts the truth of God. In the modern and certainly late modern period, there has been an explosion of modes of belief and unbelief, so that there is always the possibility that your particular form of belief or unbelief is false. We all live with that possibility. It's inescapable. So what this particular form of understanding of agency does, I think, for these conservative Christian students, is it allows them to understand their duty as a Christian in a way that allows them to engage as a democratic citizen. The idea is my living out of my Christian identity is to show up in a way that is receptive to people who think differently than me. And it's almost an amazing feat of ideological jujitsu, because what these students are essentially doing is living out their Christian commitments, which epistemologically are exclusionary. It's not that, oh, I believe in Christ, but maybe somebody else, believes in Buddha and it's all good. It's, I believe in Christ as the exclusive God. But the way I live out my belief in Christ, these students are saying, is by showing up through a really robust form of tolerance for other people, in which I listen to them with humility and try to love them unconditionally. So it's really a way to live out Christian commitments in a way that performs democratically. Just to give you some examples, one student, a conservative Christian student, says, as Christians, we believe that we're called to love everyone and serve people no matter who they are. And by our love, it shows them Christ. Not to just say, hey, you need to follow Christ, but just by serving them. Because when Christ was on earth, he served others. He spent his time with tax collectors, which at that time was a pretty bad person to be, and prostitutes, and constantly stuck up for women and did all these controversial things. I guess that's why I wanted to go to the dialogue, so I don't have a closed mind. So this, this particular quote really caught me, I want to emulate Christ by not having a closed mind. So you have this turning of Christian commitment into this kind of democratic receptivity. Similarly, another Christian conservative student talks about being a light, emulating Christ, as facing her fears by exposing herself to other people through receptivity to other people. Now, I want to be clear that at no point am I arguing that it's only ideas about agency that are creating these different ways of engaging in dialogue. I'm not trying to run a statistical study where I isolate agency beliefs as a causal variable. This is not an attempt to make a causal argument. Rather, ideas, the imaginary, are a set of understandings that make certain beliefs possible rather than causing them. There's a lot else going on here. For one, age and education, the conservative Christian students were younger and therefore may have been more open to different ways of understanding the world. And they also were quite intimidated by the Penn students, so may have been more open to them because they were at a more elite institution. And very importantly, for the secular liberal students, there was an acute political emergency. A president who was beyond the pale of anything that could have been considered within the realm of acceptable politics had just been elected, and they were panicked. So the capacity to be receptive when somebody that you have voted for is elected is going to be much higher than when somebody who terrifies you has been elected. And this is all important. However, then the question becomes, why did those Christian conservative students respond through this willingness to be formed? It seems just as likely that in that setting, students who were younger and intimidated by the education of their political opponents and who had just won an election might be just as likely, in fact, more likely to be dismissive or defensive, but they were not. And I think the reason for this is the intentional formation that happened at the college these students intended. It's not the only place that it happens, but it was happening here. I was so curious about these students that I interviewed faculty as well as the provost and the dean at this college and found out that this form of interaction was a very explicit part of the curriculum. So there was an explicit socialization in which a possibility of a Christian worldview, that is an unrealized possibility in many Christian milieus, was taken up and directly communicated to students at this institution through the explicit as well as the implicit curriculum. And I can talk more about that if people are interested. But I also think that this shows that it brings up for us an important tension within the liberal tradition. The paradox that has been often remarked on within the liberal tradition of the need to, at one hand, champion substantive liberal values, such as the equality of different persons, runs up at times against the commitment of liberalism to tolerance and to even something more robust than tolerance. But I think what is underappreciated in this tension is the role that the form of agency that is encouraged within the modern liberal tradition plays in powering this tension. That because within the modern liberal tradition, we understand ourselves as agentic in the sense of having a responsibility to perfect through society through instrumental politics, it is very difficult to fully inhabit the toleration that liberalism has also committed to, because we have a sense that we can and therefore should change the world through our political order. So in conclusion, I argue that how students navigate the modern moral order is deeply rooted in different senses of what is possible in their relationship to the political order, to the role of agency in realizing their vision of the good, and to how they understand themselves as independently or in concert affecting change in the world. And I just want to add in closing that this is not meant to be a conclusion that leads easily to some kind of change. It's not that secular liberal students should become receptive. There are many reasons not to become receptive, particularly in a middle of a political crisis. And also, it's not something that one can change at will. the Christian students were receptive because they believe that God is orchestrating what they hope to see through their ethical presence, that cannot simply be effected at will as a belief. And I will close there, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'll just end the recording, then we go to discussion.